My HOA president fined me $500 for an ugly lawn, so I used the bylaws to expose her secret. There is a specific kind of authority that comes with a clipboard and a golf cart, and in our neighborhood, that absolute authority belonged to Patricia. For 3 years, I lived in quiet contentment in a house with a modest front yard, paying my dues and keeping my head down. That illusion of suburban peace shattered on a crisp Tuesday morning, not with a loud argument, but with a crisp, white envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a citation for $500, citing unacceptable lawn aesthetics and unauthorized vegetation. I stood on my porch, coffee mug warming my hands, staring at the perfectly manicured, chemically treated carpet of grass my neighbors paid thousands to maintain. Patricia hadn't just fined me for having a few dandelions. She had declared war on my yard. And as I read the final paragraph of her citation, I realized she had made one critical, fatal miscalculation about my property. Oak Creek Estates was the kind of neighborhood where the grass didn't just grow, it was engineered. Every lawn was a uniform, emerald green carpet, treated with fertilizers that kept the soil sterile. The homeowners association governed the community with an iron fist. At the helm was Patricia, a retired executive who treated her role as president with the gravity of a general. She patrolled the streets every morning in her white golf cart, a digital clipboard resting on the steering column, measuring grass height and noting any unauthorized garden gnomes. I moved into number 42 3 years ago, drawn by the quiet streets and mature oak trees. I worked from home as a data analyst, so a peaceful environment was appealing. I kept my head down, paid my dues on time, and maintained my lawn exactly as the bylaws dictated. I mowed every Saturday, edged the walkways, and applied the recommended weed killer. It was a chore I disliked, watching chemicals seep into the earth, but I valued my peace too much to rock the boat. My perspective shifted during a brutal summer drought. Municipal water restrictions meant we could only water our yards twice a week. While my neighbor's pristine grass turned a sickly yellow, I noticed a small patch of native wildflowers growing near the storm drain. They were vibrant, thriving, and ignored by the drought. Intrigued, I spent months researching local ecology. I discovered our region was historically a prairie landscape, and the traditional turf grass we maintained was actually an invasive, water-hungry species offering zero ecological value. I decided to transition my front yard into a native, drought-resistant pollinator garden. I spent weeks studying the municipal code and state environmental protection acts. I found a specific clause in the state conservation law that explicitly protected homeowners who cultivated native plant species from local landscaping restrictions, provided they filed a simple notification with the county. I filled out the paperwork, paid the nominal filing fee, and waited for my official certification to arrive in the mail. Once the certification was in hand, I spent a weekend removing the existing sod. The physical labor was exhausting, but turning over the dark, rich soil was immensely satisfying. I ordered a custom seed mix from a local conservation nursery, featuring purple coneflower, switchgrass, and milkweed. I spread the seeds, covered them with straw, and waited. For the first few weeks, the yard just looked like dirt. Patricia drove by every morning, her eyes narrowing at the bare soil, but she said nothing. I assumed she was just waiting for the grass to sprout so she could measure it. By the second month, the native plants began to emerge. They didn't grow in neat uniform rows. They sprouted in wild organic clusters. The switchgrass shot up in tall, feathery stalks, while the milkweed and coneflowers bloomed in vibrant, chaotic bursts of purple, yellow, and orange. To a trained eye, it was a beautiful, thriving ecosystem. To Patricia, it was an absolute eyesore. The confrontation happened on a humid Thursday morning. I was kneeling by the mailbox, pulling a stray piece of crabgrass from the sidewalk when the familiar hum of an electric motor approached. Patricia's golf cart rolled to a stop directly in front of my driveway. She stepped out, her visor casting a sharp shadow over her eyes, and walked to my property line. She didn't cross onto the grass, treating it as if it were a biohazard zone. "We need to discuss your front yard," she said, her voice carrying the crisp tone of someone used to being obeyed. She tapped her digital clipboard. "The Architectural Review Committee received complaints about the unauthorized vegetation. It looks like an abandoned lot." I stood up, brushing soil from my knees, and kept my voice level. "It's not unauthorized, Patricia. It's a certified native pollinator garden. I filed the proper documentation with the county environmental office last month. It's fully protected under state conservation guidelines." She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "State guidelines don't supersede the Oak Creek Estates covenants. You signed a contract when you bought this house. Section 4 clearly states that all front yards must consist of approved turf grass maintained at a height of no more than 3 inches. This," she gestured vaguely at the blooming milkweed, "is a violation. You have 14 days to remove this mess and resod the area, or you will face fines." "I don't have to remove anything," I replied, holding her gaze. The state law explicitly overrides HOA rules regarding native plantings. I have the certification right here. If you issue a fine, I will contest it, and the HOA will lose. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think you're clever, don't you? I am the president of this association. I decide what is acceptable in this neighborhood. You will comply, or I will make your life here incredibly difficult. She turned on her heel, marched back to her golf cart, and drove away, the tires crunching loudly against the asphalt. I watched her go, my heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew people like Patricia. She wouldn't just let this go. She would escalate, dig through the bylaws, find some obscure technicality, and try to bury me in paperwork. I walked back inside, locked the door, and sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window at the vibrant, chaotic beauty of my garden. The purple cone flowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, indifferent to the suburban drama unfolding around them. I knew the battle lines had been drawn. I just didn't know exactly how far she was willing to push it, or what obscure rules she might try to weaponize next. 2 weeks later, the retaliation finally arrived. It wasn't a formal hearing notice or a polite warning. It was a crisp, white envelope taped directly to my front door. I peeled it off the glass, broke the seal, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper. It was a citation for $500, citing unacceptable lawn aesthetics and unauthorized vegetation. She had ignored the state law, fining me under the HOA's internal aesthetic guidelines. But as I read the final paragraph, my frustration melted into a cold, sharp realization. In her arrogance, she had included a detailed, time-stamped photograph of my house as evidence. And in the background of that photograph, perfectly illuminated by the morning sun, was her own house, specifically her front fence. And the paint on that fence was a shade of beige, strictly prohibited by the very bylaws she was using to fine me. I stood in my foyer, staring at the glossy 8x10 photograph paper-clipped to the heavy citation paper. Patricia had included it as visual proof of my supposed blight. In the foreground, my vibrant milkweed and switchgrass filled the frame, looking lush, green, and undeniably healthy. But my eyes were drawn to the background. Just beyond my property line, the top rail of Patricia's own privacy fence was clearly visible against the blue sky. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out. Her fence wrapped around her backyard, extending into the side yard. I grabbed my binoculars from the hall closet and focused on the wooden slats. The HOA architectural guidelines were a dense, 70-page document I had read cover to cover during my first week in the neighborhood. Appendix C, Section 4, explicitly detailed approved exterior stains and paints. There were exactly 3 acceptable colors for wooden fencing: weathered cedar, charcoal gray, and dune beige. The wood on Patricia's fence was undeniably brightly desert sand, a color that had been discontinued and banned by the board 5 years prior because it clashed with the neighborhood's strict earth tone mandate. Didn't march over to her house to gloat or confront her. Retaliation in a homeowners association requires precision, not passion. Over the next 3 days, I conducted a meticulous, quiet investigation. I took high-resolution photographs of her fence at noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the true color was most obvious and unforgiving. I compared the digital files against the official color swatches provided in the HOA handbook. The match to the banned desert sand was indisputable. Next, I formally requested the minutes from the Architectural Review Committee meetings for the past 6 months. As the president, Patricia had the authority to approve her own minor exterior modifications, but the bylaws strictly stated that any color change required a formal, written submission and a secondary signature from the vice president. I spent 2 hours scrolling through the digital archives on the community portal. There was no submission for a fence painting project under her home address. She had simply hired a crew, paid them in cash, and painted it while the neighbors were at work. I compiled my findings into a neat tabbed binder. I printed the color comparisons, the lack of approval forms, and a copy of the state conservation law protecting my garden. I placed the binder in my leather briefcase, feeling a profound sense of calm settle over me. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it in the proper forum. The monthly HOA board meeting was held on the second Thursday of every month in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with buzzing fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable metal folding chairs. I arrived 10 minutes early, securing a seat in the second row. The other board members trickled in, looking bored and slightly intimidated by Patricia, who sat at the head of the long table, arranging her pens with military precision. When she saw me, her lips thinned into a tight, triumphant line. She assumed I was there to beg for a payment plan on my $500 fine. The meeting dragged through standard agenda items: pool maintenance, trash bin placement, and a lengthy debate over the acceptable shade of mulch. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat and adjusted her reading glasses. We have a mandatory compliance issue to address. she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Number 42 has failed to rectify the unauthorized vegetation. The fine remains unpaid, and I am moving to place a lien on the property if the balance is not settled by the end of the month. She looked directly at me, a smug smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Does the homeowner have anything to say in their defense? I stood up slowly, walking to the front of the room. I didn't look at my garden. I opened my briefcase and placed the thick, tabbed binder on the table directly in front of her. I have plenty to say, Patricia, I said, my voice steady and carrying clearly to every person in the room. But first, I'd like to address the unapproved banned paint color on your own backyard fence, and the fact that you bypassed the architectural review process to install it. The silence in the room was absolute. Patricia's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The vice president, a mild-mannered accountant named David, picked up the photograph. He squinted at it, then looked up at Patricia. Desert sand, he muttered, pulling a small color wheel from his pocket. She's right. This isn't dune beige. It's completely off palette. The other board members began murmuring among themselves, passing the photos down the line. Patricia's face was now a mottled shade of crimson. She slammed her hand flat against the table, making the water glasses rattle. This is a witch hunt, she shouted, her composure entirely shattering. You are using a minor paint violation to deflect from your illegal jungle. I am the president, and I say that garden is a hazard. She turned to the board, her eyes wild. Don't listen to her. We need to vote on the lien right now. But David wasn't listening to her. He was looking at me, a newfound respect in his eyes. Actually, Patricia, David said quietly, according to Section 9 of the Bylaws, any board member found in violation of the architectural guidelines is subject to an immediate suspension of their voting privileges pending an investigation. Patricia froze, her mouth hanging open. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the board members looked from David to Patricia, waiting to see what she would do next. Patricia stood rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the folding table. She looked at David, then at the other board members, searching for an ally. But the spell of her authority was broken. David calmly picked up his pen and made a note on his legal pad. The motion to suspend voting privileges is seconded, he said, his voice steady. All in favor? 3 hands went up. Patricia's hands remained flat on the table. The motion carried. With her voting power stripped, Patricia had no legal mechanism to enforce the fine against me. I stepped forward and opened my binder to the tabbed section containing the state conservation statutes. I read the specific clause aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet clubhouse. I explained that my native pollinator garden was not only ecologically beneficial, but legally protected from HOA aesthetic overrides. I formally requested that the $500 citation be dismissed immediately. David didn't even put it to a vote. He simply drew a thick line through my name on the compliance ledger, effectively erasing the fine. Motion to dismiss the citation for number 42 is carried, he said, looking at Patricia with a cool, professional detachment. Meeting adjourned. Patricia didn't say a word. She gathered her pens with trembling hands, shoved them into her purse, and walked out of the clubhouse without making eye contact with anyone. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, and a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the remaining residents. I watched her walk up her driveway, her posture rigid, knowing exactly what was waiting for her on the porch mat. The mail carrier had just delivered it. The fallout was swift and entirely bureaucratic. By the following Monday, David had been elected as the interim HOA president. His first order of business was to issue a formal notice of violation to Patricia regarding her unapproved fence. The irony was not lost on anyone in the neighborhood. She received the exact same crisp, white envelope she had so proudly taped to my door just weeks prior. The notice demanded that the fence be repainted to an approved color within 30 days, or the HOA would hire a crew to do it and bill her for the expense, plus a daily late fee. Patricia tried to fight it, of course. She hired a lawyer and argued that the color difference was imperceptible to the untrained eye. But David, armed with the official color swatches and the photographic evidence I had provided, held firm. The HOA's legal counsel reviewed the case and advised Patricia that she had zero chance of winning in court. Facing the threat of mounting legal fees and the daily late fines, she finally capitulated. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after my garden citation, a white utility truck pulled up to Patricia's house. A crew of 3 painters hopped out, carrying ladders and buckets of paint. I stood on my porch with my coffee mug, watching the meticulous process. They power washed the old band color, sanded the rough patches, and applied 2 coats of the approved dune beige. It was a quiet, unglamorous process, but to me, it was a masterpiece. With every stroke of the roller, the physical manifestation of her tyrannical rule was being erased. But the most profound change wasn't the color of her fence. It was the atmosphere of the neighborhood. With Patricia demoted to a regular board member and stripped of her executive power, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred. The invisible leash that had kept everyone in check was suddenly slacked. 2 weeks after Patricia's fence was repainted, the neighbor across the street planted a small, vibrant bed of hydrangeas near his mailbox. The following month, the woman 2 doors down painted her front door a cheerful, albeit unapproved, shade of navy blue. David quietly reviewed the requests, approved the door color under a new accent allowance he had drafted, and moved on. The neighborhood was breathing again. People walked a little taller, greeted each other with genuine smiles, and stopped worrying about being cited for a stray dandelion. As for my garden, it reached its full glorious potential by mid-July. The switchgrass stood tall and golden in the afternoon sun, swaying like ocean waves. The purple coneflowers and bright orange milkweed created a chaotic, beautiful tapestry of color. More importantly, the ecosystem thrived. Monarch butterflies fluttered through the milkweed, laying their eggs on the broad leaves. Native bees buzzed from flower to flower, and the occasional goldfinch landed on the tall grass to feast on the seeds. It was a living, breathing sanctuary right in the middle of a sterile suburban tract. People actually started stopping to look. Neighbors who had previously hurried past my yard with their heads down would now pause at the sidewalk, pointing out a butterfly or asking me about the different plant species. Patricia, when she walked her dog past my house, kept her eyes strictly fixed on the pavement. She never complimented the garden, but she never issued a citation either. Sometimes people think that standing up to a bully requires a loud, dramatic confrontation. They think you have to match their aggression to win. But I learned that true power doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from knowing the rules better than the person trying to enforce them. It comes from doing your research, gathering your facts, and letting the system work exactly as it was designed to. I didn't need to yell at Patricia or gloat over her misfortune. I just needed to plant some seeds, wait for them to grow, and let the bylaws do the rest. It is a profound comfort to know that my home is not just a structure subject to the whims of a clipboard-wielding dictator, but a true reflection of the natural world. The battle for my yard taught me that patience and precision will always outlast arrogance. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evening, listening to the hum of the bees and the rustle of the native grass, I don't just see a beautiful garden. I see a boundary firmly and permanently established.